Lovely. Well, a very, very warm welcome, as I already said, to this evening's event, which I, for one, hugely look forward to. Since I realise that indeed some of you may not have come across the Insiders Outsiders project, I hope you'll forgive me if I say a few words about it by way of introduction. My name, as you can see, is Monica Bohm-Duchin. I'm a London-based art historian with a long-standing interest in issues of art in relation to displacement, migration, Jewish identity, the Holocaust, Second World War in particular, and so on and so forth. My own parents were indeed refugees from Nazi Europe, so you can see where the impetus came from in its most essential form. I had an idea actually already some years ago that it was time to pay tribute to sort of acknowledge the immensely rich and varied contribution of refugees from Nazi-dominated Europe to this country's culture in a way that had never really been done before in quite the same detail and analytical and nuanced sort of way. And I initiated this project called the Insiders Outsiders Festival that took the form initially of an in-person, this was pre-COVID, an in-person nationwide year-long festival that really astonished me in the way that it just grew and grew and attracted a very wide range of different venues and individuals under its umbrella. It took place between March 2019 to March 2020. We all know what happened in March 2020. COVID struck, and thank goodness it didn't strike any earlier. But the obvious thing to do was, like so many other people, to go online. And, you know, blessings in disguise, as my lovely father used to say, that actually going online, of course, has given the Insiders Outsiders project an unexpectedly rich and financially viable afterlife. And we have, as you will be aware, I think already, we have this ongoing program of online events on related themes. I should also add, though, that this particular event takes place in partnership with the Wiener Holocaust Library, which many of you will know, a very eminent institution in London, in conjunction with their Fred Kormis exhibition. Now, Fred Kormis, I won't say anything about him except that he was German-born, Jewish, came as a refugee, established his career in this country. It's an exhibition that runs just for a few more days. So if you're in London and haven't yet seen it, it runs till the 6th of February. And I've been working with Barbara Warnock, the curator, on actually quite a large big series of events, all on sculpture-related themes. And this actually, regretfully, is the last in that particular series. Okay, so if you want to find out more, go to the insidersoutsiders.festival.org website. You can sign up for the newsletter at the bottom right of any page. The homepage will do, and you'll then be subscribed to our newsletters. And yes, the event's being recorded for those of you who actually would like to listen to it again or spread the word. It'll be uploaded onto the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel. And though I say it myself, it's proving a increasingly rich sort of source of recordings on a whole array of different topics. You will see for yourselves how wide the range is. Okay, so without further ado, as you all well know, the focus today is on Charlotte Mayer. I'm so delighted at the sheer number of people who've expressed an interest. And I think it's partly because, of course, Antonia herself is a wonderful artist in her own right. And by her own admission, this is the first time she's actually been felt able to talk in detail in this sort of forum about her mother. And I think that's something, Antonia, perhaps we can talk about later if you would like. Let me start by saying a few words both about Antonia and her sister Louise, who many of you will also know. They both sent me very eloquent descriptions of themselves. So rather than me improvising, I will just read to you their own words, if I may. So starting with Antonia. So in her own words, an internationally renowned ceramic artist, but brought up in a household dedicated to modern sculpture and architecture, her childhood was infused with an awareness of form and space. She studied geography and geology at Sheffield University and later attended Harrow School of Art as a studio potter. A year spent studying in the Middle East and India made a deep impression on her. And after returning to England in 1985, she established her first workshop in London. In the late 1980s, she returned to Sheffield, where she still lives and works. And then on to her sister Louise, who will be coming in, as it were, a little bit later in the presentation. Again, her own words. As a young person, Louise heard stories from her mother about life in Prague and the journey to England, which has had an undeniable impact. After 3 years teaching in Africa, Louise returned to the UK and started to work with refugees. 38 years later, she has listened to thousands of stories of persecution, flight, and the truly inspiring ways refugees from Rwanda, Congo, Bosnia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Iran, Eritrea, and of course other countries have settled and so richly contributed to the life of the United Kingdom. She's currently working on a programme to support health workers, refugee doctors, nurses, midwives, and others to gain professional registration, to return to their careers and contribute to our beleaguered NHS. So without further ado, I will turn to Antonia to start talking, but Louise is going to be working the images. So I'm going to make myself invisible and hand over to the two of you. So Louise, if you'd like to, yes, start screen sharing.
Great, lovely. Monica, thank you for such a nice introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to talk. As Charlotte's daughter and as a fellow artist, we had many years of conversations together about our working lives, as you can imagine, and we influenced each other's work by critiquing and encouragement for over 40 years. In the last 4 years of Charlotte's life, I assisted with her studio production as she became frail. So this talk is a personal view of her life and work, and much of it taken from the stories that Charlotte herself told the family. Charlotte's sculpting career spans nearly 80 years, and for over 60 years, Charlotte completed many public commissions and numerous private requests for work. She had a long collaboration with the Pangolin Bronze Foundry based in Stroud, who cast most of her sculptures. And Pangolin commissioned the photographer Steve Russell to take images of Charlotte's work, and they've kindly agreed to share many of his photographs for this talk. It was actually only after my mother's death in November 2022, as we went through her archives, that I came to have a clearer perspective of her life and vocation. And I realized how rare it is for a person to connect with their path so early in life and to follow it literally until their end. In many ways, it's not surprising, for making art was an emotional lifeline for my mother. She often said that in her life, there were just a few key themes to which she returned, reworking them, and always from a slightly different perspective. So this is one of the reasons why I chose the title of this talk to be The Spiral of Life. So I'll start by giving you a brief tour of her studio to give you a sense of her working space. Then I will tell you about Charlotte's childhood before moving on to her sculpting career. And for the final part of the talk, I will show you 3 projects that had special personal significance for Charlotte. So here is the studio. You can see it was an extension built onto the family home. And the studio was originally built by my father, Geoffrey Salmon, for his architectural practice. It was built on 2 levels, and each area was 5 meters square with high ceilings, which was a perfect space for sculpting at all scales. The lower garden level was used for constructing forms, and you can see some of the original models or maquettes on the shelves. Charlotte used a wide range of materials to construct her sculptures, things such as twisted fine bamboo, carved balsa wood, bending aluminium wire and foil, and using wooden or metal rings. And then she overlaid these materials with wax, plaster of Paris, cardboard, clay, even apple peelings, in fact, anything that would work for her vision. Then there's the upper level of the studio, and that was used for welding and electroplating, and also for waxworking. And you can see the wax pots here. And then there was also plaster modeling and then carving large blocks of polystyrene. So you can see them in the picture here. And there's Charlotte working on the wax base. So now I'll tell you her story. Her full name was Charlotte Renée Fanta Sturz, and she was born in Prague in 1929. She really loved recounting stories of her early childhood because for her it represented a time in her life of belonging, safety, wonder, and utter delight. And in those days, most middle-class Jews living in Prague spoke German as their first language. They felt great affinity to Central European culture, with the arts, intellectual inquiry, and trade freely flowing across the borders. Charlotte's stories always began in the garden of a large house, das Roselhaus, or the Rose House, which was the home of her beloved grandparents, Eduard and Ruzhina Stutz. The greatest influence on Charlotte was her grandmother, Oma Ruzhina, who was an absolute powerhouse of energy and creativity, and whose influence stayed with Charlotte forever. Ruzhina had a great sense of humor and introduced Charlotte to biology, art, music, sculpting, and all things that would support her curiosity. So now we're going to listen to a brief extract made by Czech TV in 2021. And in this interview, Charlotte describes her first intimations of wonder about form and color.
Well, I could talk about the Rosal House and my grandparents for the whole hour. They, I would say, were the most important people in my life, and particularly my grandmother, Ruzhina. And we had a wonderful relationship. And in her garden, they had a beautiful, huge garden. And in her garden, she had a little vegetable plot. And in the vegetable plot, there was a little pond. And she would give me a little net to fish out algae from the pot. And then we would take this into her house. And then she showed me the beautiful, beautiful patterns and colors which came out when one looked through a microscope. And I think that that was perhaps one of the most important early influences, because if you look through a microscope, it is neither figurative nor it is abstract. It's just patterns and colors.
So I noticed that somebody couldn't see the video, and I hope that all of you, most of you were able to see the video, but anyway, we'll carry on. I hope you can see the shared photographs. The earliest memory of sculpting for Charlotte was at 4 years old, when she sat on a stone bench beside the White Lady statue in the Rosal House garden. And here there grew a large walnut tree which dropped its fruits onto the bench. Charlotte broke open the ripe fruit and the ripe walnut shells to reveal the contorted form inside that was delicious to eat. And then she noticed that the outer form and its inner space could be entirely different in structure and substance. And she also recalled spending time with a loyal housekeeper. Her name was Made, and Made always carried in her pocket a very small silver penknife. And she showed Charlotte how to carve little baskets from chestnuts. Many years later, this memory influenced the making of casta in stainless steel. What Charlotte didn't speak to us about was the more complex situation of her parents. Indeed, it wasn't until we were 15 years old, and after her own mother had died, that Charlotte told us of the existence of her birth father, Kurt. Her birth parents, Fanta and Helena Stutz. Court and Helen came from highly cultured families, and theirs was a society marriage, and Helen soon gave birth to their only child, Charlotte. But it became clear that her parents were not emotionally compatible, and within 2 years became estranged. Charlotte's mother, Helen, then developed a romantic relationship with a rather dashing man called Frederick Mayer. He later became a wonderful and supportive stepfather to Charlotte, and as a result, she chose to use his surname of Mayer as her professional name. When her parents' divorce came through, it was explained to Charlotte as a mere formality. However, 8-year-old Charlotte regarded the world around her with increasing awareness and anxiety, and the breakup of her parents' home coincided with the rise of Nazism in Europe. Although nothing was talked about in front of her, Charlotte was aware of the growing unease. In 1938, Hitler invaded Austria and encircled Czechoslovakia. By then, all school children had to say Heil Hitler every morning, and Charlotte was advised never to speak of her family's Jewish heritage. With the annexation of Austria, Charlotte's uncle escaped to Paris, and as pressure built, he traveled on to the USA with his young Hungarian wife. Charlotte's mother, Helen, as a Jewish woman, and her new partner, Frederick, who was a communist, understood their imminent danger, planned their escape in 1939. But to their profound dismay, they could not persuade Helen's parents, Edward and Ruzhina, to join them. Edward and Ruzhina felt safe, for they had many good friends who were German and Austrian. And so, at the age of 10, Charlotte and Helen took the train to Amsterdam under the pretext of attending a friend's wedding. In Charlotte's small pink suitcase, she took her favorite toy bear, and she was told not to talk to anyone about her journey, which she immediately did, of course, to a very friendly German army officer. But that is another story, and in this case, one of unlikely compassion, for he aided their safe hiding when the train emptied out in the middle of Germany. After reaching Amsterdam, Helen and Charlotte travelled on to London, and there they were met by Frederick, and they were taken in by the Quakers. Within 2 weeks of having been left behind, Charlotte's grandparents were exposed to the horror of invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Nazi army. Edward and Ruzhina then set about sending regular, reassuring letters, censored, of course, to their son in the USA and to Helen and Charlotte in England. This correspondence became Ruzhina's lifeline over the next 4 years. She described how the Rosal House was taken over to become a Nazi headquarters, how Edward had collapsed and died suddenly in 1941, and how she lived a very highly restricted life in one small room in Prague. Ruzhina's letters always expressed hope to return to her sculpting, to play her viola, and to see her family again. But she must have known how precarious her fate was becoming. Yet in her final letter in 1944, she wrote, "I am leaving Prague today and will be able to breathe the country air," and she signed it off as the Lioness. In fact, Ruzhina knew that she was going to be taken to Terezín. This town lies just north of Prague and was being used to gather thousands of Jews prior to their transportation to the concentration camps. She went to Terezín in the summer of 1944, and in October she was transported by cattle truck to Treblinka, where she was murdered. Meanwhile, in England, Charlotte and her parents had to integrate as quickly as possible and became fluent in English very quickly. Along with many European refugees, they were sent north to Merseyside and then to the Lake District. Charlotte was badly bullied at school, and life as a young refugee with a European accent felt very unsafe. However, life took a better turn at her local school in Ambleside in Cumbria. Charlotte's talent for writing was noticed as outstanding, and as a result, she was given a scholarship to attend the esteemed Kendal High School for Girls. 2 weeks after Charlotte started at the high school, both Frederick and Helen were hospitalized with pneumonia. So Charlotte transferred to live as a school boarder, uncertain whether her parents would survive. She was really traumatized by losing her home again, and her distress was redirected into daydreaming, prolific story writing, and art making. It was because of Charlotte's hyper-focus on art that the art teacher recognized her talent and recommended to Charlotte to apply to Goldsmiths College in London for their 2-year foundation course. And so it was at the age of 16 that Charlotte's sculpting career began at Goldsmiths College. The principal, Harold Wilson Parker, was married to a successful professional embroiderer, and his respect for women artists was implicit in his teaching. Charlotte recounted that one day Harold Parker took my arm and said, "It's easy to model an arm. What is more difficult is the elbow, the wrist, and all the joints. That's what you have to watch." This had a lasting impact for Charlotte's figurative works, where you will notice all joints are highly considered. A second significant teacher was Ivor Roberts-Jones, whose sculpture of Winston Churchill stands in Parliament Square. He stressed the importance of finding the essence within every form and of examining its vital geometry, a lesson that she took with her through her sculpting life and she passed on to me. We shared many conversations about this when we were discussing our current work. And then from Goldsmiths, Charlotte went to train at the Royal College of Art for 3 years. Unlike Goldsmiths, there were very few female students, and it was an environment of institutionalized misogyny. Actually, this only had the effect of strengthening Charlotte's determination to work professionally and certainly not to have any babies. In fact, she claimed that when she first met her husband-to-be, an architectural student called Geoffrey Salmon, it was only his respect for her sculpting that enabled the relationship to develop. During her time at the Royal College of Art, Charlotte met her third great teacher, Frank Dobson. His message to Charlotte was keep it simple, and she abided to this mantra. Now, the dominant notion in mid-20th century art was truth to material. So every student became skilled in life drawing, wood and stone carving, clay modeling and plaster casting, life modeling, letter cutting, and all of these served her well throughout her career. Charlotte particularly loved wood and stone carving and assumed that she would become a figurative sculptor. In fact, in her final show, it demonstrates this interest in figurative work. In her final year, the tutor John Skeeping informed her that to be a sculptor, you have to be 1 part artist and 9 parts navvy or labourer. And this was just as well, because soon after she graduated in 1952, Charlotte received her first commission for a depiction of a mother and child for the maternity wing of Epsom Maternity Hospital. And for this, she made a plaster model or maquette of a mother and child, which she then translated into carving a 1-ton block of plaster, alabaster. This was a monumental carving for which she needed an assistant. The final mother and child was over 2 meters tall and a stunning example of mid-20th century figurative carving, inspired by Mayol and Gill. The hospital board of trustees, however, regarded the mother and child as too modern because, after all, it doesn't even have ears. The work was transported to the hospital and never placed on public display. It was a really sobering experience and an early lesson in the fickleness of the art world. Now, the expectations of many women in the 1950s England assumed a woman's role was centered on home life. Charlotte balked at this notion, and in Geoffrey she'd found a husband who genuinely supported her career. However, despite these ambitions, for the next 10 years, sculpting was put on the back burner as the pressure to follow social conventions took hold. Charlotte wanted to support Geoffrey's aspirations as an ambitious young architect, and during the 1960s they embarked on many joint projects of restoring a subsiding Victorian home, community activism, lots of partying, and raising a family of 3 children. Looking back at that time, Charlotte declared this a lonely period of her life with a reliance on Valium. And I remember family life being very busy, highly creative for us children, and yet there was a sense of disquiet. What Charlotte needed was to express herself through her artwork and to assuage her continuing sense of great loss and longing for Ruzhina. She felt different. Her European accent contributed to a sense of not quite belonging within English society, and she didn't know many other artists who were refugees. I remember when I was a child of 6, finally something in the air lifted when Charlotte began to work again. She rejected the exhausting and time-consuming process of stone carving and instead found a much faster process when she made a series of torsos. For these, she was building layers of resin over steel armatures and then honing back to refine the forms. 20 years later, Charlotte returned to a similar working process, sculpting figurative animals, this time building layers of plaster of Paris over the steel armature. And then in 1967, there was another shift of energy, and it coincided with the death of her uncle Frank in New York. Here, Charlotte explains what happened next.
My mother and I went to New York in '66 because my uncle had died. I was completely bowled over by Manhattan in the snow with these huge skyscrapers, and I thought they were so beautiful. So when I came back to England, I made a lot of sculptures, some of which I still have, but they were made in wood, and I called them Black Cities. So I then wanted to exhibit them, and I spoke to various galleries, and every one of the galleries said, well, yes, that's fine, but we can't sell wooden sculptures. If they were in metal, if they were in steel, then we would be interested. So I thought, well, there's only one way. I've got to learn how to do welding. So I went to British Oxygen and joined a lot of plumbers who were all learning how to welding. But that was oxyacetylene welding, which I found very scary. I had a friend, and I still have a friend. I had nowhere really to work, where to work. And she said, come and work in my cellar. So I bought all this equipment, went down into the cellar, talked with her mother. Her mother said, well, we better just check up with the insurance company. So they did, and they threw up their hands in horror and said, what, oxyacetylene in the house? Absolutely not. So I had to sell it all back again to British Oxygen, at a discount, of course, as you can imagine, and learn electric welding. So I did another course.
And here's the first black city, which she made in wood. And then subsequent black cities were produced in steel. So now re-energized, Charlotte was looking to the urban landscape for her inspiration. For example, she was looking at billowing smoke from Battersea Power Station, and this was abstracted into graceful stainless steel sculptures. In the early 1970s, Charlotte's life took a new turn, an inward one. She was 45 when she was introduced to a path of meditation that became a twice-daily practice for the rest of her life. The philosophy behind this meditation is the notion of non-duality, and in practice, this meant becoming aware of immutable consciousness or unity of being that lies behind our everyday activities and all forms of life. Sculpting and meditation together acted as an emotional anchor as she navigated complex demands of our family life. She claimed that the combination of meditation and art making contributed to saving her own life as she went through 3 separate episodes of cancer later on. Now, the immediate expression of her spirituality in her work was a focus on sacred geometry, and in particular, the spiral motif. Spirals are the essence of all organic growth. They represent a journey between stillness and movement, contraction and expansion, and they are timeless. And they connected Charlotte to the wonder of her childhood in the Rosal House garden. She worked for over 40 years on different iterations of the spiral, at first in more formal geometric terms, and then increasingly expanding the boundaries. So here follows a group of images showing the development of the spiral forms from the 1970s through to the 2000s. And this one, Ascent, was a prize-winning stainless steel sculpture which stands in the Barbican today. Here, this is the making of Pharos. Charlotte glued multiple sections of carved polystyrene onto a huge polystyrene cone. And that's the final version. And then there's another commission, that of Moon Arch, which was made in plaster modelled over expanded steel. The finished sculpture is now located in a residential school for autistic young adults, and they can climb through it, which she really enjoyed. And then finally, Sea Scarf. So by the 2000s, these spiral sculptures were becoming finer and filled with light and increasing dynamism. These works were made from carving individual wooden spars which were fixed at gradually shifting angles. And these sculptures became some of her most iconic works to be cast in bronze over the next 8 years. So here's a series of photographs of sculptures in this mode of working. And finally, a monumental turning which stands 3 meters high and is located in Bicester, Oxfordshire. So for the last section of this talk, I will tell you 3 stories of sculpture making in relation to significant life events for Charlotte. And the idea is to give you a deeper sense of her emotional and practical processes involved in working on particular projects. The first of these is Sea Circle, which was completed in 1984. Do you remember the urban riots in the hot summer of 1981? There were pitched street battles in Brixton, Birmingham, Leeds, and Liverpool between disaffected youths and the police. And as a result, the government commissioned the Salmon report, which highlighted endemic racial disadvantages in our society. Charlotte was much affected seeing the images of police brutality. The persecution of innocent people by the state deeply resonated with her experience. And then an opportunity arose in 1983. She was asked to submit a design for Toxteth in Liverpool, the location where the riots had first begun. Merseyside was the first place where Charlotte's family had settled 50 years previously, and she felt an affinity to the location despite its recent decline. During her meditation, she saw a simple sculptural form for this commission. She had to communicate her idea to the Liverpool councillors in a way that was easy for them to understand. She cut a spiral line into a small sheet of copper foil and twisted it into a circle, a sea circle, echoing the maritime history of the city. She laughed as she described pulling this tiny maquette out of her handbag and surprising the councillors with her design proposal. They approved, but with a very tight deadline of 10 weeks to complete it. So she fabricated the large sculpture in the garden in an outdoor studio that Geoffrey built for her. She used huge sheets of flexible wire mesh, which is normally used in construction work. It was cut, twisted, and then held in place by a system of wires and ropes attached to the studio roof. And then she covered the mesh with a thin skin of plaster of Paris, into which she could refine the form and create textures. I remember holding the twisting mesh while she secured it, and she explained to me that if you can get the lines just right, then the whole form will feel integrated. The final finished sea circle appears simple, and the patination, an encrusted blue-green colour, evokes the comings and goings of sea vessels in the port city. Sea Circle stands today on Seymour Street in Liverpool. The next project is the Tree of Life, and this was completed in 1989. It arose from a sad time in the life of our family. The project started in 1983 when Charlotte planned to submit a design for a large-scale sculpture outside a shopping centre. The initial idea was for a stylized tree, and she worked on many small cardboard models held together with masking tape and pins. All these experiments felt unconvincing, and she rejected them even before submission. A stylized tree motif, however, remained in her awareness. Memories of trees in the Roselhaus garden contributed to their childlike abstracted forms. A year later, Charlotte was invited to submit a proposal for a 40-foot high sculpture for the Abbey National Building Society's headquarters in tiny models, and then produced an anodized aluminium tree at 1/10 the proposed size. When it was presented to the board of the Building Society, they chose not to waste shareholders' money, and they backtracked. Charlotte continued to experiment on tree-inspired designs for the next 4 years, but now focusing on the intricate spaces between the trees and the branches, the branches and the leaves. And then in the summer of 1988, our brother Julian became ill with cancer. One day in the autumn, when he was receiving treatment, Julian came into the studio while Charlotte was working on the cardboard tree model, and he exclaimed, "That is my tree of life." There and then, Charlotte decided to make a tree of life for Julian. She worked on this using thin sheets of wax, which were painstakingly pierced, honed, and textured. Week by week, as winter drew on, Julian's condition worsened, until finally, in the new year of 1989, he was admitted to hospital for palliative care. Julian had a challenging childhood, and Charlotte's work to complete the Tree of Life became an epic effort to communicate her love for him. As Julian lay dying, Pangolin Bronze Foundry altered its casting schedule and were able to deliver the Tree of Life to the hospital just 1 week before he died. Julian loved the sculpture, and its presence on the ward had a really profound impact on the staff. Now, the story of the Tree of Life didn't end there. For 3 years after Julian died, Charlotte herself was diagnosed with breast cancer. She continued to work through her treatment, and because of her close connection with the new local hospice in North London, Charlotte began to work on a large-scale Tree of Life. She constructed the work from 8 sheets of plywood, pierced and honed to the same stylized leaf pattern as the smaller model. And then she worked at the foundry to refine the casting. The final Tree of Life was patinated in a soft green-blue colour, and it now stands 2 meters high in a quiet courtyard garden in the North London Hospice, where it exudes calm and joy. 33 years later, at the end of her own life, Charlotte returned to making tree forms. This time, the working models were more spontaneous, asymmetric, and expressing a wildness and freedom, as if they were figures pointing the way. So my final story is about the making of a sculpture called Thornflower. And this story completes the spiral of Charlotte's life, as you will hear. Soon after the horror of 9/11, the world seemed to be on the brink of another war. Charlotte began experimenting on a new sculpture that started out as a personal homage to her grandmother, Ruzhina. This bronze sculpture is 1.5 meters tall, and it's made up of 3 soft amber petal-like forms held high and growing out of 5 dark grey brutalist upright thorns. The petals virtually embrace the thorns. Thornflower appears to be both soft and fluid, rigid and sharp, rounded and straight. And for every quality, there is its counterpart. So now Louise is going to tell you the story of its making in Charlotte's own words. And these were taken from an interview that she gave to Pangolin Gallery in 2018.
Making of Thornflower is the story of a journey from duality to unity. It is also, in part, a story of healing. My beloved grandmother, who was the best person in my life, died in the Holocaust. She was full of courage and an amazing person. In 1944, she was transported to Terezin and later forced onto a train that took her and hundreds of others to the extermination camp at Treblinka. My mother was unable to talk to me about my grandmother's fate. It wasn't the done thing to talk to children about horrors. It was clear to me, however, that her deep distress made her increasingly ill over the years. I believe this happened to a lot of survivors because they felt guilty for being alive and living in a safe country. And as an only child, I carried this burden. And it has also made its way through to my own children. For many years, before I began making the maquettes of the Thornflower, I had been fascinated by thorns of all descriptions and made many drawings. I remember on one occasion when sunlight caught the raindrops on the thorns of a wild rose, glistening like jewels. I was filled with awe at this transformation from threat to delight. The first sculptures deriving from these studies were small models in wood and cardboard, each taking the role of an intensely personal memorial to my grandmother. I began to think this piece in terms of a possible Holocaust memorial and realized I needed to go to Terezin, which I did in 2003. When I returned home, I asked a sculptor friend, Naomi Blake, who was an Auschwitz survivor, to come to my studio and look at the sculpture, which I had started before the trip. She took one look at it and said, "It's much too beautiful. It's not cruel enough." So I took the sculpture to bits and let the whole thing rest. The problem was, it didn't leave me alone. It would not let me rest. So I turned my mind back to the sculpture, to a new approach. I realized that what the sculpture had to be was a uniting of the thorns and the flowers. 5 thorny uprights and 3 flowers made it a sculpture of 8 units. The number 8 consists of 2 circles joined in the middle. The upper circle symbolizes the world of spirit, the lower one that of matter. The longer I worked on that sculpture, I pondered man's inhumanity to man, past and present. The concept of a Holocaust memorial changed to an urgent wish to make a sculpture uniting opposing elements of thorns and flowers, and which would speak of reconciliation, of peace, and oneness.
And the finished Thornflower has been exhibited in several cathedrals in Britain and now is in the permanent collection of Coventry Cathedral, where it stands at the entrance to the Chapel of Unity. Charlotte visited her sculpture 5 months before she died. Coventry Cathedral also accepted the Tree of Life, originally made for Julian, and this is placed in their Millennium Chapel now. And to complete this talk, here's a final image of Charlotte happily working on one of her last sculptures, an orb filled with space that she aptly called Evening. if any of you would like to see Charlotte's sculptures in person, there are 3 galleries showing her work. There's Pangolin London in King's Cross, and they have a large selection. Also, her work can be seen at Gallery Pangolin in Bebb Contemporary, located in Hampshire. And all of these galleries have websites with the sculptures on.
Thank you so much, Antonia. I don't want to interrupt in case you haven't finished, but I think
I have finished.
you
Thank
probably
you.
have. Lovely. How
Yeah.
beautifully presented and eloquent that was. And Louise, likewise. Fine. So we've stopped screen sharing. We do have some time left. I think we've just had some very nice compliments coming in. But are there any questions at all that people would like to perhaps type into the chat in the first instance? I wonder, just while people are thinking about that, if I could start the ball rolling, perhaps. I mean, there are many, many threads one could pick up on, but perhaps starting with one of the last things you were talking about, her work for the Christian, or in the context of the Christian church. This is something that I personally am very interested in, and Coventry, of course, is a classic case of Epstein, starting with Epstein, but also there are other Jewish and emigre artists who have, whose work has been absorbed into that extraordinary project. How did you feel about that? Did you talk about that aspect of placing her work in that context at all?
Well, I think for Charlotte, different religions, she respected all religions, and so I don't think there was any sense that it was different from how she was brought up. In fact, she was Catholic. When they came to England, she was baptized into the Catholic Church. But her whole attitude to life was one of finding unity rather than emphasizing our differences and separations.
Interesting. Do you know more about that conversion to Catholicism? Because that's quite a dramatic move, even if you weren't a practicing or observant Jew, but to actually make that decision. Do you know anything more about it?
Well, in fact, her grandmother, Ruzhina, was a Catholic convert. So although the family came from a Jewish heritage and really respected that, they were secular Jews. Her grandmother was a very spiritual person and found her thing in the Catholic Church. So that wasn't, it wasn't a big step. But my sense is that when they came to England, in order to integrate, Helen and Charlotte became Catholic as a way of somehow integrating into British society.
Yeah. Although actually choosing Catholicism wasn't perhaps the obvious thing to do.
No, I know.
In England, but interesting. It's classic,
Yes.
isn't it, though? I mean, the sort of the cliche, but it's so true that it was the Nazis who made so many Central European Jews aware of their Jewishness. Yes, indeed.
Absolutely.
Indeed.
Yeah.
I'm just going to check the chat in case there are any questions have come in. Lots of compliments, as you probably can see. Yeah. Okay. Oh, so much one could talk about. Louise, I don't know whether you wanted to sort of say any more. No. There was a fleeting sort of mention of her sense of who she was and the complexity of it being transmitted to the next generation. And as I'm sure you're very much aware, this whole sort of slightly problematic but certainly interesting concept of transgenerational, intergenerational trauma is a rather hot topic at the moment. I wonder if, either of you, no pressure at all, but, particularly you, Antonia, as an artist, whether you feel, what you might say about that.
Yes, there's been so much written, hasn't there, Monica, about the impact on second generation and maybe third generation as well. And there's been, research into epigenetics now. And I think there's much more understanding about the impact of intergenerational trauma. And I think, in a sense, for all 3 of us children, we all became good listeners and we became very attuned to emotional climate in a room out of necessity. And I think that's a common theme amongst second generation, that you spend your childhood somehow making good, you know, trying to make good. And in fact, it was an explicit message from my grandfather, Frederick. He said, your generation has to make good for all the bad that has been done at the beginning of this century. I don't know if you had a similar experience,
Not as
Monica.
explicitly.
Yeah.
I wonder, I mean, how old was your mother when she started talking to you explicitly about her sense of loss? Do you recall, was there a moment when she began opening up?
I would say in my memory, always, you know, this profound loss of her, especially her grandmother and of the Rosal house. Um, as far as I remember, you know, in my memory, it's always been there. It was just implicit, but how it came out to us as young children was always the delights, you know. And then as we grew up, it became darker and darker. And then, as I said in my talk, you know, it was only when we were 15 and her mother, Helen, that there was this huge reveal that actually our grandfather, you know, wasn't who we thought it was. Yeah. I don't think the influence of the Holocaust has directly influenced my work as such. I think my work has been influenced probably more by my parents' love of art and architecture and being brought up in that environment.
I was struck, I mean, you chose to show the pictures of the Toxteth riots in 1981 as, in some sense, being relevant to the work that your mother then produced as a sculpture, public sculpture for Liverpool. And that was interesting to me because, of course, there isn't a direct visual or obvious link between the two. And yet, yeah.
Well, I think it's always, you know, it's always the emotional impact of things, you know, that has fed into my mother's work. And I mean, even, you know, refugees from the Middle East, even as in her 90s, you know, she was living in a house with a spare bedroom. You know, we had to persuade her not to take in refugees. She would have done that when the Russians came into Ukraine. She would have taken Ukrainians in. I mean, she couldn't have looked after them because she was frail and elderly, but it was the emotional impact that really informed a lot of her work. Yeah.
And Louise, sorry again, I don't want to put any pressure on you to say something, but it seems transparently obvious in the best possible way that, you know, your choice of work has a direct link to your mother's life story. I don't know if you would like to say something a little more about that.
Well, it is linked, but it wasn't a particularly conscious link when I moved into refugee work. And it was sort of, after a while, I thought, this makes sense. It makes so much sense. And yes, and it's been an absolute privilege, I would say. Yeah.
And Antonia, I'm still looking at lots of lovely comments coming through, but let me just double check. I can't see any questions as such.
May I interrupt and ask a question?
Yes, with great pleasure.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
I can't see who that
I'm
is.
not very good at typing and all this
No,
business.
please do, please do, with pleasure.
Very un-high tech. I just wonder, with both of you, I do remember very, very distinctly once picking up Louise from Highgate when we were going back to university one day, and your mother making the lovely comment that she was going to miss your music. And I wonder to what extent music was important to her in her work or whilst she was working. To me, the shapes are, for me anyway, I see music in them. And when I hear music, I see those sorts of shapes and the spirals.
You know, Charlotte, in the Rosal house, there were gatherings by my great-grandparents of poets and musicians, and they were very well known for these gatherings of you know, poets, musicians, artists, and so on. And that had a profound impact on Charlotte in her childhood, and she loved music. She particularly loved piano music. I think her connection with nature and with sound, with chords, I think all of that plays a very big part in her work, because it has the essence of form. You can sense it. in her work, as you've said already. Yeah.
Would anybody else like to simply unmute themselves and say anything? Even a comment rather than a question would be absolutely fine. Okay. I wonder if I might just pick up on a few quite specific things. I was delighted but not surprised to hear of the reference to the Quakers helping. The Quakers are, I would say, almost the unsung heroes of the refugee story, both then and now, and indeed going right back to the aftermath of the First World War, if I understand it rightly. And there is actually a session on the Quakers on our YouTube channel, which might interest you. Also, you mentioned her teacher at the, was it at Goldsmiths or at Royal College? Was it Ivor? No, hold on, have I got that right? Robert Ivor Jones, who did the
Yes.
Churchill. Slightly oblique this, but actually one of the other talks that was given in person at the Wiener Library just a few weeks ago, which is available as a recording on the Wiener Library website, not on the Insiders Outsiders one, was actually by Oscar Neyman's daughter. And Oscar Neyman is best known for the rather wonderful sculpture he did within the Houses of Parliament themselves of Winston Churchill, who's of Yugoslav Jewish origin. You also mentioned Naomi Blake, who's the mother of Anita Peleg, and she likewise at the Wiener Library gave an in-person, in fact, a hybrid talk, which was recorded about her Holocaust survivor and sculptor mother, whose work again is quite oblique and never explicit in its references, but full of a sense of the need to build bridges between human beings, in the most profound sort of way. We've talked about the Christian element. I think maybe it's time to stop. I mean, unless you wanted to add anything, and indeed, as I say, last chance to the assembled audience to ask. Yes, Anna, is that?
Yes,
yes.
There a possibility of seeing this again, because I've been deeply moved by it.
Absolutely. As mentioned, Anna, it's been recorded. I've been double checking the recording.
I'm not technical at all. How do I
Very, very simple. You simply go to the Insiders Outsiders Festival website. If you just type in Insiders Outsiders Festival, but it's .org, and there's a YouTube channel. What I'll do, if you sign up also to the newsletter on the website, I will mention this recording in the next newsletter. But it's actually very simple, because once you've got the link, once you find it, you simply click on it and there it is for posterity. So it doesn't require any great technical sort of sophistication.
I just don't know where to start.
And I don't know, well, I'll tell you what, if what I'm going to do, I'm going to just put into the chat the website. Let me just do that, make sure I don't make any mistakes. And if you click on, hold on, sorry, now I'm already making a mistake.
While Monica's doing that,
yes,
if anyone wants to look at my work on my website, you can just Google Antonia Salmon ceramics and have a look at the gallery pages there. If you want to contact me directly, there is a contact page on that website.
Just Antonia Salmon.
Antonia Salmon ceramics.
Oh.
Google does wonders. It's quite easy. You don't even need the exact website address. I've just typed into the chat the Insiders Outsiders Festival website. If you just click on that, it'll come up on your computer, and then you'll have it in front of you. And I'm just thinking maybe
click on. I just don't know where to look.
Just click on the link on the link I've given you, and it should come up on your computer.
What link?
Look in the chat.
That's down the right-hand side.
Yes. And the last
message, Charlotte Mayer talk. That one.
I assume so. And the very last entry should be the website, which other people might like to also click on, just so you have it to hand.
Monica, the recording won't be available until later.
Not just yet. We have to kind of tidy it up a little bit, but it should be within the next week or so. Antonia, I'm just thinking maybe by way of a kind of finale, would you like to say something about your mother's impact on you as an artist? I mean, I think for those of you who know your work, it's actually fairly evident, perhaps for those people who are not so familiar with your beautiful ceramic work. Do you want to just sort of end by telling us a little bit about your sense of her influence on you?
I think, I mean, obviously I've given a lot of thought to this, and I think, to be fair, the aesthetic influence is probably from both my parents, actually, because they were, as an artist who was interested in architecture, and then an architect who was interested in art. You know, we were taken to galleries, exhibitions, historical houses. And in my work, there's also this formal geometry at the basis of a lot of my work. But I guess I think probably the biggest influence of my mother was her approach to making, because although making was a kind of an emotional anchor for her, actually the act of making was a form of prayer. Not Jewish, not Christian, not, you know, but this approach meant that I think it's not a form of prayer in any pious sort of way. I think if you sit with her work and spend time with her work, whether it's work that looks apparently dynamic or not, it does have an inner life, a sense of stillness pervades it, and a real liveliness. And she wanted to bring beauty to the world, and so do I, you know. And I think her approach has really influenced me. Now, I would say something that really has influenced me. She had an attitude of gratitude. She was so grateful to Britain for taking her in. She was so proud when she became a British national, which may sound strange to young people now, but if you've had everything taken away from you. But more than gratitude, she wanted to, I think, reciprocate and give. She really wanted to give through her artwork to the world. And I think that that's also influenced me as well. And I think Louise and our brother Julian, we've all had a sense of service to the community, to humanity, or to the environment. So quite a lot of influences there. Long answer.
Absolutely. No, a lovely answer and a good place, I think, to end. Very good. Well, what can I say? That was wonderful, as you've seen from the appreciative comments coming in. Thank you so much, both of you. And
thank you.
So beautifully presented. I mean, just lovely, lovely, lovely. And good. Thank you, everybody, for being here. As I say, the recording will be available very soon, and I look forward perhaps to seeing you at some other events in the future. Take also a look at the YouTube channel. There are many things of interest there, though I say it myself. Lovely. Good night, everyone, and all the very best. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.